Good morning. Oh, that was great. Thanks so much. Welcome to Planet Word, you guys. How are we feeling today? Excellent. My name is Britt Oates. I'm the manager of public programs here at Planet Word, and we're super excited to welcome you to today's event as part of our Eyes on Reading series with Planet Word's journalist in residence and host of the award-winning podcast Sold a Story, Emily Hanford. This is Turning the Science of Reading into Classroom Practice, featuring language and literacy expert Dr. Tiffany Hogan. Now, today's program will include a talk by Dr. Hogan, after which Emily will join the conversation and moderate a brief Q&A. But before we begin, just a couple of reminders. We'd like to ask that you please silence and, if possible, dim the light of your cell phone for the duration of the program. During the Q&A portion, if you would like to ask a question, be sure to raise your hand nice and high and wait for one of our team members to bring a microphone over to you. As you can tell, we are recording today's program, and we want to make sure that you are heard. All right. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Emily Hanford to welcome our esteemed guest for today.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Yeah, thank you so much for coming today. I first met today's guest back in 2019 when she invited me to be on her podcast. Tiffany Hogan's podcast is called See, Hear, Speak, and it's for people who care about reading, language, and speech. And that is one reason I invited her to come to Planet Word. Tiffany's research is all about how tightly linked speech and language skills are to reading ability. There was a time when the dominant view in education was that if children had good language skills, if they were exposed to lots of books, they would learn to read. The field is finally coming around to the reality that this is not the case. It takes a lot more than good language skills to become a good reader, but that does not mean that language skills are not absolutely essential. They are. And Tiffany has become a clear and trusted voice, helping lots of people understand why language matters so much for reading. And there's another reason that I invited Tiffany here to Planet Word this morning. Over the past several years, she has been focusing on something else too. She has been focusing on something called implementation science. That is the work of getting knowledge into practice. And as you will hear this morning, Tiffany argues that in reading, we don't have a knowledge problem anymore. We don't really have a knowledge problem right now. What we have is an implementation problem. And Tiffany, in her research, in her teaching, in her podcast, is not just working to connect what we know from science to what happens in classrooms. She is actually studying how that connection actually happens and why it so often doesn't. Drawing on insights from fields like medicine to rethink how education brings evidence into practice. Tiffany Hogan is a language and literacy researcher at the Massachusetts, I'm from there, I should be able to say it. Tiffany Hogan is a language and literacy researcher at the Massachusetts General Institute of Health Professions in Boston, and she's a research associate at Harvard Medical School. Please join me in welcoming Tiffany Hogan.
Thank you, Emily, for that warm welcome. I'm so happy to be here today. I'm going to start out with a number. 17. That's the average number of years between a scientific discovery and the time that it impacts you. That means that a child born today, if we make a scientific discovery today, it will not make it into their classroom until they are entering the last year of their formal education, their senior year of high school. Here's another number for you, 14. That's the percent of significant scientific findings that'll ever impact you. The rest never make it out of publication into practice. Contrary to the common narrative, this is not a knowledge problem. This is a systems problem. The system is the problem, and it's quietly, silently, enormously impacting millions of children in classrooms across the U.S. today. I'm a behavioral scientist and a speech-language pathologist. I study how children learn to read, and in particular, how language affects their ability to learn to read. So I came to reading research through a side door. I was treating children who had speech and language problems in preschool, seeing them around 3 or 4 years of age. I would work with them for a couple years and then send them on to kindergarten. They had made great progress. And then it never failed. I would get a phone call a few years later, and it would be a parent of a child that I had served, and they told me their child had a reading problem. This happened so much, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. It's what drove me to obtain a PhD, and these are the children that I still serve today. In 2010, I co-led a team called LARC, Language and Reading Research Consortium. Multiple universities, over a dozen researchers, and we had one question. What are the key components to comprehension, and what does it take to actually teach them in the classroom? And that's the work I want to tell you today, because it's one of the clearest examples I have of the 17-year, 14% problem. This is a story about what happens when the science is strong, the funding is real, and the intention is good, but the science still doesn't make it into practice. Today we're going to go on a journey together for the next 45 minutes, and I want to start with these 2 key points. Number 1, there's a field called implementation science, and that studies the gap between what we know to do and what we do every day. This is a full field of study with lots of tools and techniques. And it's something that very few people in education are talking about yet. The second point is that the gap between research and the classroom, it's not inevitable. It's a choice that we're making, and we can make a different choice. We can make a choice to make sure that more children receive evidence-based instruction in the classroom. So in 2010, the Department of Education funded something called the Reading for Understanding Initiative. It was 6 teams across the US, 30 states, and it included nearly $120 million of funding. The charge was very specific: focus on how to improve children's comprehension. Reading for Understanding was one of the largest coordinated investments in US history. Inspired by the government initiative to land a man on the moon in the 60s, this was the education moonshot. And LARC was one of the 6 teams that was funded. I want to pause here and tell you why the Department of Education created this education moonshot. Because to understand what Reading for Understanding was chasing, we have to understand an equation. In 1986, 40 years ago this year, 2 scientists, Goff and Tumner, some shocked looks here, published a paper that has been tested in many languages, and it's been cited over nearly 10,000 times in other papers. But the formula is very simple, and it's been the backbone of the research that I've done. It was the backbone of the first paper I published 23 years ago, and it still continues to inform my research. It's the foremost framework for the science of reading, and it's remarkably clear. This simple formula captures the complexity of how to explain what a child understands when they read. If you want to know how well a child reads, you need to know 2 things. You need to know how well they can read words and how well they can understand spoken language. Word reading is the ability to accurately translate printed letter patterns into spoken words. This is spoken words that are read aloud if you're reading out loud, but also spoken words that you create with your inner voice if you're reading silently. Language comprehension is the ability to understand spoken language. And here's the critical part. This is not an additive formula. This is multiplicative. So if either one is 0, then reading comprehension can fail. But let me give you an example. You probably didn't think you'd see The Simpsons here today, but here we are. So in this example, Bart is in trouble per usual, and he has to go every day after school to read to his grandfather. His grandfather has cataracts, so he can't see the print on the page very well anymore. So Bart reads to him, and grandfather understands the language that Bart creates. But here's the catch. Bart is reading German. He's been learning how to decode German words, which is actually pretty easy. They have a pretty straightforward letter-to-sound correspondence in German. So he's reading these German words, but he doesn't really understand the language that's created by the text. But grandfather does. So who do you think in this case is actually reading? Is it Bart, who's reading the words on the page and turning it into language? Or is it grandfather who's understanding the language from the text? Well, I already gave you the answer, because the simple view of reading would state that neither one is reading, because you have to have both parts of the equation to really understand text. So in this example, you see that grandfather has good language comprehension, but he can't read the words on the page because of those pesky cataracts. So his reading comprehension, according to the simple view, would be 0. Now we have Bart, who was good at reading the words. He could turn those letters into spoken language, but he didn't understand the language that was created by the text. So he's also at 0. We need to have both what Bart can do, read words, and we need to have what grandfather's doing, which is understanding language. But it might be hard for you to imagine reading words and not being able to understand the language created by those words. They're so intimately tied. So I'm going to put you in that space for a minute. I'm going to read a short passage to you, and then I'm going to ask you some comprehension questions. So I'm going to test your comprehension today. Sally first let loose a team of gophers. The plan backfired when a dog chased them away. She then threw a party, but the guests failed to bring their motorcycles. Furthermore, her stereo system was not loud enough. Obscene phone calls gave her some hope until the number was changed. It was the installation of the blinking neon lights across the street that finally did the trick. Sally framed the ad from the classified section and now has it hanging on her wall. So were you able to read all of the words on this page? I assume you probably were. So let me ask you some comprehension questions. Where did Sally put the gophers? Why did Sally want the guests to bring their motorcycles? What did the ad say? I see a lot of blank stares. You're missing a critical piece of information that will help you to be able to comprehend this text, and it's the title of the passage. So I'm going to give you the title of the passage, and I think when you have that title, it's going to feel a lot like glue that connects together sentences that didn't seem to be together in the passage. And then, because you have that connection, I'm going to bet you'll be able to answer the comprehension questions. The title of the passage is Getting Rid of Bad Neighbors. Sally first let loose a team of gophers. The plan backfired when a dog chased them away. She then threw a party, but the guests failed to bring their motorcycles. Furthermore, her stereo system was not loud enough. Obscene phone calls gave her some hope until the number was changed. It was the installation of the blinking neon lights across the street that finally did the trick. Sally framed the ad from the classified section and now has it hanging on her wall. So let's see if you can answer the questions now. Where did Sally put the gophers? In her neighbor's yard. Why did Sally want the guests to bring their motorcycles? It's loud. What did that ad say? House for sale, apartment for rent. You got it. You put that together. So you went from someone who couldn't comprehend the spoken language to someone who could, but the whole time you could read the words. What you just experienced, reading every word and not comprehending, and then comprehending the second you had some language scaffolding, is the life of a child with weak spoken language. Every day in every class, they're confronted with language. They're sitting in a class that assumes they understand it as long as they're able to read the words. And this is the right moment to give you a name. Some of these children, the ones who can read words well, but don't understand the language created by the text, many have a condition called developmental language disorder, or DLD. I want you to hold on to that name because it's going to come back at the end of the talk. DLD is a neurodiversity. It's part of the human condition. It occurs in approximately 1 in 10 children, which means every class, statistically speaking, will have 1 to 2 children with DLD. This means there's 5 million children in kindergarten to grade 12 in the US alone who have developmental language disorder. You may be surprised to learn that DLD has the same prevalence as another neurodiversity you've likely heard of, dyslexia. And there's a high overlap between the two. Children with dyslexia have difficulty reading words, and if they have that difficulty, they have a 50% chance of also having DLD or difficulty understanding language. Researchers have been studying DLD in the scientific literature for over 200 years, and yet only about 20% of children with DLD ever receive support services. They are hidden in plain sight. They're often mislabeled as shy or immature or a behavior problem. And because language is the conduit to which we learn everything in school, science, social studies, even math, they struggle across the grades unsupported. And the long-term consequences are serious. Children with DLD are more likely to interface with the criminal justice system, not understanding their Miranda rights. They face more years of unemployment. They have a higher risk of suicide. And girls with DLD are more likely to encounter a sexual assault. Research shows that receiving support early does decrease these negative consequences. Why are these children hidden? Well, that goes back to the simple view equation and what happened to it for the past 40 years. The educational system swung between the two halves, decades of reading wars. At no time have both sides of the simple view of reading been systematically and explicitly taught in our educational system. At no time. We believe this is one of the reasons that national literacy scores have been flat for so long. But in recent years, the word reading half of the equation finally became a movement. Researchers, educators, parents, journalists, Emily Hanford, and her prominently awarded Sold a Story, documented how American schools had drifted away from the systematic word reading instruction and how children were paying for it, especially children with dyslexia, who had passionate parents who got together and formed Decoding Dyslexia, a powerful coalition. Together, their efforts reached millions of people, and legislation passed in almost all the states. Curriculum changed, teachers were trained and retrained. It was a genuine reckoning, and it mattered. But why weren't educators teaching word reading? Because they were told that kids would learn to read naturally with exposure to language-rich classrooms, when in fact you need explicit and systematic instruction in both word reading and in language comprehension. So while we're starting to see in schools a focus on explicit and systematic instruction in word reading, we haven't seen that yet for language comprehension. And that's the half of the simple view that I've spent my career studying. And it's also why these children with developmental language disorder are being left behind. So in 2010, it was the half that the Department of Education bet on for that education moonshot. One of the primary outcomes of LARC over those 5 years where it was funded was a curriculum called Let's Know, and that was building language to improve comprehension. Over 800 30-minute classroom language comprehension lessons for a year each in pre-K, kindergarten, and 1st through 3rd grades. It had 4 units, 2 nonfiction units, which were animals and earth materials, and 2 fiction units, which were fiction and folktales. Scripted lessons followed the same format of scaffolding, modeling in an I do, where the teacher models an approach, we do, where they worked on it together, and you do, where they had independent practice. It had materials to support every lesson. Here's what Let's Know was designed to do. It was designed to systematically and explicitly teach language comprehension, which was the other half of that simple view of reading. For decades, the field assumed that children would just pick up language comprehension. If you read to them, if you spoke to them, it would just bloom on its own. But the science said otherwise. What the science says is that children need explicit systematic instruction, especially children who struggle, like children with developmental language disorder. But let me show you concretely what Let's Know was teaching, because language itself has an architecture, and lessons followed that architecture. So I want you to picture some nested bowls. The smallest bowl is words. Words are our basic unit of meaning, our vocabulary. But words are not stored in a file cabinet. They're actually stored in webs. So this is an example word, installation, and it has neighbor. It's in a neighborhood of deployment, setup, construction, and other related words like reinstall, uninstall. So in Let's Know, vocabulary lessons weren't a dictionary definition. They were teaching words in webs. And they taught teachers evidence-based routines to teach vocabulary over and over. The word bowl is nested in larger bowl, which is sentences, because words are just floating around until they have that sentence framework. Sentences are how words combined according to rules. So we wrote routines for teaching sentence structure explicitly, how a sentence about installation works differently depending on whether you're describing it, explaining it, or arguing about it. The largest bowl is connected sentences. This is how we have conversations, make arguments, and importantly for comprehension, how we tell stories. It's like the example of getting rid of bad neighbors, which happens to have the word installation in it. So we built text structure knowledge, inference routines, comprehension monitoring, so children knew when they had lost the thread when they were reading, and they knew what to do about it. So words are inside sentences that are inside connected sentences, and that's what Let's Know taught. That's the architecture of language comprehension made into lessons. We piloted these lessons. We revised them and revised them again. But this is the part I want you to remember. We did not create these in a laboratory. We worked with hundreds of teachers across the nation to make sure that these lessons worked in classrooms. And then we ran a randomized control trial, the gold standard in science, across the states, hundreds of children and their teachers. Full classroom implementation of Let's Know versus business as usual. And it worked. Children who received Let's Know improved on language comprehension that we targeted, and the gains fed into stronger language and reading comprehension. I want to be honest about how we felt at that moment. We had built it. We had accomplished our moonshot goal. We had published it. It was a randomized control trial. And this is what happened next. And I'm going to be honest with you about this, because the honest version of what happened next is the whole point of this talk. The plan was simple. We would make Let's Know free, or I like to say it's prepaid with your tax dollars. You go to the website, you download the lessons, use them in your classroom, and that's it. But we had no marketing team. We had no sales team. We had no professional development. We had no coaching model. We had no onboarding for districts. But the curriculum we learned is not just lessons and materials created through a randomized control trial. A curriculum is lessons and materials plus training, plus a schedule that has room for it, plus a principal that supports it in a school, plus an assessment framework that measures who's learning from that curriculum and who's not, to find children like those who have developmental language disorder. But we skipped all of that. We put a 5-year, nearly $2 million curriculum on the internet, and we hoped someone would find it. I can map that failure onto a pipeline. Research has to travel from a journal article with studies that are quite controlled to studies that are conducted in the classroom, through curriculum adoption with teacher support, through integration into teacher preparation programs, and into policy changes. And finally, it makes it into everyday classroom practice. At least 6 handoffs. Very few findings survive all 6. We thought we had leapfrogged the pipeline by skipping to the end, but we hadn't. We had only got to the first 2 steps. The evidence to practice gap is a problem that I helped create because I was doing exactly what researchers are trained to do. I have the honor of spending so much time with teachers, training them on the science of reading. And recently I was training some of my local teachers. We had done a 6-week book study. And at the end, I asked them, what'd you think? And it was really quiet for a while, and I knew I was in trouble. And one of the teachers raised her hand and said, we're mad. We're frustrated. We know what to do, but we can't do it. We don't have the materials. We don't have the support. We don't have the systems in place to make sure that this evidence gets it into practice. And this is a slide visual of me training educators on the daily on the science of reading in my neat little white box. I'm right there in the middle saying A equals B. Here's the science of reading. This is what we've discovered. And then educators go back to their classroom and they say, each red line represents a barrier to implementation of evidence-based educational practice, what we know works to improve children's reading skills. I want you to hold the story of Let's Know next to the story of training teachers. With Let's Know, we were researchers who had spent tons of time and money creating a curriculum, and we had no system to deliver it. On the other hand, I work with educators who have the knowledge, and they've spent the time learning the knowledge because they want what's best for their children, and they don't have a system to actually have the evidence bloom. These are different sides staring into the same gap. But alas, there's an entire field of study that I told you about, and that failure is what the field of study is targeted for, and it's not really known to educators yet. It's called implementation science. It came out of medicine in the early 2000s when researchers noticed that breakthrough after breakthrough was not making it into clinical practice. Then education started to borrow some of those tools. Implementation science states that the problem is not the research, it's how research can't make it through that pipeline. And it says, let's treat schools and classrooms not as an afterthought to the science, but as an actual site of the scientific problem and working together. Here's the core of it, 3 moves focused on the system. 1, first you identify specific barriers to evidence-based practice in a specific place. You have to ask in a specific school, what's getting in the way of this evidence-based practice? Is there a lack of materials, a lack of support, a lack of time, a lack of assessment, a lack of leadership? But also you want to identify the facilitators as well. What's working in that school? Then second, you want to match each barrier with a strategy designed to remove it. There are actually libraries of hundreds of implementation strategies that have been tested scientifically to remove barriers. This work is really about matching the right strategy to the right barrier in the right school. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's context dependent. It's a targeted response. And the third one is measure whether the strategy actually reduced the barrier. There's a saying, we inspect what we respect. So we want to measure, did this work? So were you able to get the right materials? Were you able to create the right setting for evidence to occur? Identify, match, and measure. That's what implementation science does. Let me tell you about a study with implementation science methodology. Researchers went into a school and they trained a group of educators on an evidence-based practice. They trained them using all of the right methods, well-informed science of reading training. Then they collected data in the classroom to see who was actually using what they learned. And they found that some teachers were able to do it. They took that knowledge and they applied it in the classroom, but some weren't. So they wanted to learn what would help those who were not able to apply the evidence in the classroom. So they had 2 conditions. One was more training. That's what intuition says, right? If they aren't able to do it, they need more training. But the other condition was, what if we asked them why they are not able to do this? What are the barriers that are getting in the way? And then what if we work together and we removed those barriers? And that's what those researchers did. They worked with the teachers and they removed the barriers. And what did they find? More training did not make a difference. It wasn't a knowledge problem. But what did make a difference was barrier busting. Once they removed the barriers, the evidence was apparent in the classroom. It's not a knowledge problem, it's a systems problem. This study changed how I think about my own work. The training is necessary, but it's not sufficient. A few years ago, I was contacted by an educator and literacy coach, Margaret Goldberg, and Emily was critical for that because I was on a podcast with her, and I mentioned how I really appreciated Margaret's blog, The Right to Read Project. And Emily told Margaret about it, and she contacted me. Margaret contacted me because she was working in a school district as a literacy coach, and they had spent a lot of time on word reading. They had made major gains, but they weren't tackling language comprehension. And she wanted to get both sides to her children. And because I study language comprehension, it was a great match. So we formulated a research practice partnership. That means we started to work together, researcher and practitioner. What makes this type of partnership different from the usual pipeline is in the usual pipeline, researchers think about research questions in their laboratory. They develop and design the research study, they go into a school and they do the research, but it's just geography. They're not working together with the educators. In a research practice partnership, you actually work together. The educator gets to help you decide on the research question. They help you decide on the condition and how to run that study. And this matters because the number one predictor of whether a finding makes it into the classroom is whether it matches the context of that classroom. Co-creation between a researcher and an educator is really the number one predictor of whether education findings make it into the classroom. This follows in line with an important movement that says there should be no research about me without me. Teachers who will ultimately implement evidence-based practices should be included in the decisions about their practice to get those practices into classrooms sooner. So Margaret and I started talking regularly, and then she came to my lab and I went to her school, and it wasn't just us, it was our teams working together, her principal Jamie and her teachers, PhD students Corinne and RJ. We worked together. We started the implementation process. So first we identified barriers and facilitators, and I'm going to tell you a few of the things we heard because I want you to hear what it's like when science of reading ambition meets the real world. So first, we found there was a content gap. This is not because the educators at her school were deficient in any way. They were, on the contrary, extraordinarily well educated. But they had been told that language will bloom naturally. They didn't know that it had to be explicitly and systematically taught, so we worked on creating a shared language around language comprehension. So when we talked about it, we were all talking about the same thing. They also didn't have the materials. They weren't readily available. How do they teach language and language comprehension? There was no professional development. And, as I mentioned, for Let's Know, we didn't have that. We didn't have that support. But they had some facilitators, and Margaret was herself a facilitator, an amazingly educated and committed literacy coach. They had a principal, Jamie, who made time for this work. So we started then to move on to matching some strategies to reduce the barriers. We had some professional development that created shared language. We started working together. We obtained a small grant to download the curriculum and put it into binders because a curriculum setting on a website does take work to download and organize. We ordered books that went with the curriculum. Some of them were out of print. We had to track down more books. And we provided ongoing training to Margaret and her team, and she was able to provide ongoing coaching. And then we measured how many lessons did they teach? How many minutes were they able to teach language comprehension? How many books were used that we had purchased? And did they get their questions answered in an ongoing coaching session by Margaret and our team? And here's what changed at Margaret's school. It's the change I care about the most. The conversation changed. Before, the conversation was, go read a book, go take a professional development day, come back and get it into the classroom. But they were starting to ask different questions. They started to ask, what is getting in the way of supporting children's language development? And what is our plan to remove it? These are profoundly different questions to ask. Instead of asking what do teachers need to know more about, they asked how to change the system. The first question puts the burden on the teacher. The second question puts the burden on the system. This is implementation science at work in a real school. And educators are the true implementation scientists because they do this every day, every single day. They work hard to make sure that the best evidence gets to their children. My job as a researcher is to help them with that process. There's one more thing I want to tell you, though, about implementation science. Implementation science is not just the 3 moves that I showed you. It also says that we need to put the practice into schools in stages. So when schools skip stages, and they often do because they're under pressure to meet certain outcomes, then we find that the implementation will fail. Not because the practice was wrong, because the system just wasn't built for that practice. It wasn't ready, and it wasn't evaluated and continually improved. That is a very different diagnosis than teachers just didn't buy in. Because implementation science shows that change-making, true, sustainable, positive change-making, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Sometimes we have to slow down and be thoughtful before we can speed up our progress. Here's what Margaret, Jamie, and her team did that was so insightful. They formed an implementation team. They took their existing instructional leadership team and turned it into this implementation team of lead teachers and school specialists to go through that implementation process together and barrier bust. Implementation teams are an evidence-based strategy to improve implementation from implementation science. They also did something else. They took the stages and they applied them to something new, writing. They implemented a new writing curriculum, and instead of doing what most schools do, which is buy a curriculum and spend a few days in August training their teachers and tell them to go do it, they asked the question, what can we do to create a system that supports language curriculum? They knew implementing the new writing curriculum would take more than knowledge, it would take a sustainable system. And this is what it looks like when implementation science actually takes root in a school. It doesn't just change one curriculum, it changes how a school thinks. It changes how evidence gets into classrooms, and a child will benefit. Reading scores increase, sustainable systems are created, teachers are retained and feel good about their work, and this is what's happening in Margaret's school. And we have started to share that story at both educator and science-focused conferences. Pulling this all together, my colleagues and I are formulating what we've learned from this framework into a new framework called the Simple View of Outcomes. It borrows from the logic of the simple view of reading, which we know says that word reading times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. The simple view of outcomes says that literacy outcomes are the product of 2 things. First, knowledge, what we teach, the content of the science of reading, both halves of the equation. Word reading and language comprehension, and the evidence base around it that continues to evolve. And second, the systems we need to have in place to teach it. The implementation science that makes it possible for schools to deliver on the science in sustainable systems. And just like the simple view equation, if 1 is 0, the outcome for literacy outcomes will be 0. Right now, we've been pushing hard on the science of reading, and that's what we need to do. We've been asking teachers to deliver science, though, in systems that were not built for it. A big, publicly funded curriculum, Let's Know, set on a website for years. We put it on in 2016. We did not yet understand at that time that science and systems were 2 sides of the same equation. The frustrated teachers that I trained, they said, I understand the science, but I don't have the systems. We cannot fix literacy outcomes with another training. We have to fix the systems. And now I'm going to end where I started, with that number, 17. If the pipeline doesn't change, then we don't change anything. But there's a difference that we can make because we know the gap, it's not inevitable. When research practice partnerships create findings that are immediately applicable to classrooms, that pipeline accelerates. When barriers are named and removed, instead of assuming teachers just need more training, then that pipeline accelerates. When we build systems in stages, supporting schools along the long haul rather than just overnight change being expected, then that pipeline accelerates. The word reading and dyslexia movement already showed us that this is possible. It did not take 17 years for Sold a Story to reach almost every state legislator. When journalism, educators, science, advocates, and policy move together, time can collapse. So let me point to a more optimistic future for us. A baby is born today, the same day that we make a scientific discovery. If we can accelerate that pipeline, we can embrace implementation science along with the science of reading. By the time that child enters kindergarten, that scientific finding will be in her classroom and positively impact her reading outcomes. Not 17 years, 5 years, maybe 7. As I close, I will end with 3 key points that I hope you carry out of this room. I hope you leave remembering the name I ask you to hold on to, Developmental Language Disorder, DLD, and remembering that there are 1 or 2 children in every classroom who have it and who are counting on you, the adults around them, to see it. Focusing on systematic, explicit instruction and language comprehension in every classroom will support all children, but especially children with DLD. I challenge you to learn more about DLD by visiting dldandme.org. Speaking of systematic and explicit instruction in word reading and language comprehension, here's a twist that I'm going to leave you with, and it's especially apropos in a museum dedicated to language. It's all language. Word reading is relating sounds to letters to make words. And as we discussed, language comprehension is words, sentences, and connected sentences. That's all language, and it's developing from birth. Keep it in mind as you continue to think about the connection between language and reading and how we can build systems to support it. We need to explicitly and systematically teach word reading and language comprehension, and all children will comprehend text better if we do this, especially children with dyslexia and DLD. And thirdly, I hope you understand that closing the gap is not just about knowing, it's about the systems. It is about building the systems that can carry that knowledge to the child. The next time you hear about an investment like Reading for Understanding, I want you to ask 2 questions. 1, is the science good? But 2, who is building the system that will carry the science to the child? Because that gap is not inevitable. It's a choice. We can make a different choice by considering both the science of reading, the knowledge, and implementation science, which is the sustainable systems to deliver that science to the children that we serve. Thank you so much. I couldn't do this work without funding from the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Education, and foundations who care about children's language and literacy. I want to thank my lab, my collaborators, and my school partners. Implementation science is a team science, and I could not have done it without them. And last but definitely not least, I want to thank Emily for inviting me. I want to thank everyone here at Planet Word for celebrating language. Thank you.
Come on over. Thank you so much. A celebration of language. Here we go. So I'm going to just follow up with a few questions for Tiffany, but we really want your questions. So get those ready. There are some people with microphones who are going to go around the room if you've got a question. Thank you so much for that. It was really just so much in there, so much to learn from, and so many things put together so well. So let me start a little bit with your personal story that you talked about at the beginning, which is you're a speech language pathologist, you're working with these kids, you're helping them out, sending them off to kindergarten, and a few years later they're coming back and their parents are saying, oh, the school says this kid has a reading problem. So is that still happening to a lot of kids? What is still widely misunderstood about the important link between language and reading ability in schools or among all of us?
It's a great question. I want to start by saying that the science is solid. So back when I was practicing, it was starting to emerge. It had been there, it was kind of in the journals, but now it's been studied many, many times. So the science relating early speech and language to reading is there, but the systems are not in place. So this is continuing to happen. Children who are served early for speech and language problems are typically served through early intervention, which is Part C, and that is birth to 3, and then they're served in early childhood through a different funding mechanism. So they often have different labels that are used to qualify them for services. So in early childhood, they're told you have a developmental delay, so you need some support. Then they go into early childhood and they're told you have a speech and language impairment, so you get support, typically by a speech language pathologist at that time.
And maybe the parents not understanding
No.
that these are different labels for the same thing.
Totally, yes.
I see.
It is
They're like,
not
I was told one
connected.
thing about my
Yes.
kid, now I'm
Yes.
told another thing, so they're starting to get the alphabet soup situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And because of the different systems, they're often dismissed from services age 3. So parents are thinking they're doing great. And then they go on to early childhood, and then a new group of professionals say, wait, this child isn't really understanding. They have another evaluation, a different label, different group of professionals, not making that connection. Then they go on to elementary school, a different system, and a different set of assessments, a different system to qualify children for services. And at that time, they get typically qualified as having a specific learning disability, either for word reading and language or language only. They have a different set of professionals. So that connection's not being made, and that's actually why there was an international consensus, not just in the US, but internationally recognizing this problem and saying we need one label for these children. And through a process of hundreds of researchers, parents, advocates, they came together to say we're gonna call this condition developmental language disorder.
Okay, so that is the culmination of that.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, so no wonder it's so I'm sure there are parents in the room and people who are parents and teachers. This is something that I hear all the time from parents is there's this like extraordinary frustration and a look back like all these different places failed me. And it's not really that they individually necessarily failed the kid. It's just that along the way it wasn't adding up to anything that was enough of a solution or even just understandable for the parents and the children. There's power in understanding sort of what the issue is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's really not those educators that were serving the children along the way. They care deeply about these children.
Yeah.
And many times they see this system occurring, but they're in a system that doesn't support the child.
And then they can't do anything about it.
They
So
can't.
that's what's so frustrating for the teachers is they start to get the bigger picture, but they're like that one in the graphic. They just go out and say,
Yeah.
this isn't really my job, right? Whose job is it?
Exactly.
Well, and that's sort of another question. Whose job is it to do the systems? Like, where's the accountability? At the end of the day, like, who do we look to say the system isn't working and so it's on you, fix it? Who is it? Is it the principal? Is it the superintendent? Is it the school board? Is it the state policy? Who is it? Where does the buck end?
This is a great
The
question.
software.
And when I studied implementation science, it occurred to me, wait, we're all in systems. So we can blame the system, but we are all part of the system.
Yeah.
So even when I was training those teachers and they said, we're so frustrated by the system, I said, you should be. It's a frustrating system. But you also live in this system and you can change the system. So who is it going to take? Anyone really can change the system. And I truly believe what you did with Sold the Story is a perfect example. As a researcher, I had been frustrated by this disconnection and knowing that we need explicit systematic instruction. But I had been so frustrated, I frankly kind of gave up. I just thought, well, this is the system I have to work in. So I started training educators like, this is what we know, but this is what you're going to have to do. Here's the materials you might receive. This is what we have to do.
But then you're just kind of like Sisyphus.
You are. You're
just
not.
like-
You're giving up, and it makes sense because you have so many problems to solve. But ultimately, your story gave inspiration to everyone to say we need to get the word out there, and you never know who can really change that system. So many different levers can be pushed. And so I don't want to be vague.
So there are different people in different systems
Yes.
who become the kind of like catalyst people to change it.
Yes, I'm not
like
being
Jamie
vague.
and Margaret at their school.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I think Jamie and Margaret are
Yes.
working in a system that doesn't 100% back what they're doing at their school.
Exactly.
They're one school in a system,
Exactly.
and they're just trying to like show something at that
Yes.
one school.
And you really never know who you're going to inspire
Yeah.
when you do this work.
Yeah.
You know, you do your work, you change your system. Maybe you think you're only changing it in one spot,
Yeah.
but then when you start telling your story, it has an effect. Has
Yeah.
that butterfly effect, and then the system starts to really change. And we saw that with dyslexia, we saw it with word reading, it's still happening, and we want to have that same movement occur for language. And we want to recognize that changing systems is a science,
Yeah.
that we have this implementation science. So we don't have to do this without tools and techniques to support our change.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I think one question is, as you've mentioned, there's been an investment. There's a real investment going on by many states, a lot of money in teacher training and teaching teachers about the science of reading. But I think you ask a profound question, which is like, so should states be continuing to invest the amount of money they are in knowledge, or is that money better used or should also be used doing something else? Like if you're a policymaker in this room, what do you do to address the problem that you have identified here?
You have to invest in both sides. So we continue to invest in knowledge. We have to get the knowledge out there, but we can't ignore the implementation aspect. Some states are really starting to focus on that. Massachusetts is focusing on systems and creating system scans and focusing on what's happening in systems and providing supports. We have to recognize that those policies are fantastic, but they have to cover both sides, and they have to fund both sides as well.
So what does that mean? How do you fund both? How do you fund the other side? What do you fund?
Yes, so this is a good question, and I don't have the exact answer, but I have an idea.
Okay.
So I think we have to fund the process. So when we think about that, what that means is we have to fund training on implementation science. What does it look like? We fund all of it. We have to fund research practice partnerships. You know, a lot of times schools are right next to universities that have a lot of, findings sitting right there. And researchers on the whole love working with educators. That's their life's passion. So reaching out and making those connections and funding those connections long term is critical, because then it can help the educators to know the science that's out there, to have access to it, and work together. So we have to think through funding the system change through implementation science, through research practice partnerships, and sustained funding. So we have to not just do it in a one shot or even 3 years. It's not enough. We need more time.
Yeah. And what you're also saying is it's worthwhile. Teachers need to understand that there is this thing called implementation science. It's another place that they could build knowledge. Like education field doesn't know about it yet.
Yes, exactly. And it's not to add more to what teachers do, because they do so much.
Yeah.
Actually, this should release the burden from the teachers ultimately, because teachers want to be in a system that recognizes evidence. They want the support.
Yeah.
You know, so once they have that support, it should actually reduce the burden on educators.
This is something I find myself saying all the time. There's also something just about understanding the fact that it exists and the very big ideas, the kind of stuff that you can express in a talk like this, that really help. It's not like it's up to teachers to now go study implementation science and to understand everything about it, but just to understand some of the basics, like it is here, there are some big findings, there's some like tools, like, okay, like these big as a journalist, I so believe in kind of like helping people see the big picture, like helping people look up and be like, oh, right, and either like recognize something or just have a little insight, like, oh, that's what's going on, like this is the bigger picture. And I'll just note to the audience that one of the people that you cite on your slides is Patton Terry, who's Nicole Patton Terry, and she is going to be our guest in September. And you talked about how so many universities have schools right around them, and she's going to come with a principal who was right around her, and it was exactly the same problem. Nicole was driving to work by a school that was not doing very well and thought like, okay, I know all this stuff about language and reading, and this school is struggling with language and reading, and I'm going to call the principal and be like, do you want to work together? And it's the story of her and working together with the principal. I think these kinds of stories of like researchers and educators working together are really important for everyone to understand. Like this can happen, it does happen. And it can be literally like, if you're a teacher, reach out to the researcher near you. If you're a researcher, reach out to the teachers near you, because something really great can happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, okay, so here's another thing. So as a journalist, I'm very committed. I love what you said. I love your assertion that knowledge isn't really the problem, it's a systems problem. As a reporter, I love revealing the knowledge problem parts to people. Like that's sort of at the heart, what I like to do is like explanatory journalism. Like, look, gee whiz, see, look at this. And I struggle more with the system stuff, like even like getting stories to my editors. Like how do you, it's actually kind of hard to tell stories about systems. They get wonky and complicated and not I like complicated, but like complicated in a wonky way that can be hard to like figure out where the story is, you know?
Yeah.
And so I am kind of interested, like for me, who goes into schools a lot, but not every day like teachers. And for people in this room, some of you are teachers who go into schools every day. Some of you probably don't really go into schools very often. Like if I was to walk into a school on a Monday, on this Monday, where would I see the systems problem? Like what's an example? Like, oh, that's the systems problem.
Yeah. There's a lot of examples.
Okay.
But unfortunately, it's almost like the elephant in the room where everyone's talking around it, but no one's saying it. So for instance, when I go talk about language, the elephant in the room is they don't have any assessment for language. So they have no idea.
They just have no idea
how to know who's
right.
getting language or not. So when I train teachers how to do language assessment and work in partnership with schools, one of the first things they say is like, wow, when I gave that assessment, I didn't realize the kid that was shy in the back of the room actually had language difficulty and needed my support. So assessment is one. Another one is just as simple as space. I was asked to come to a school, and I was looking around. They had 2 classrooms, and one was doing better in word reading than the other, and they couldn't quite figure it out. It was like the teachers seemed to be well educated. They had the same materials. And what was shocking to me is when I went in, one classroom was big and beautiful and had different stations, and they were moving around. The next classroom, right next door, was a third of that size. They couldn't move around. When they were doing the lessons, it was like, oh my gosh. And so I said, what if you switch classrooms for literacy? Just switch for that time. And then they did, and it actually made a big improvement.
Wow.
So even those little things, if you think about the graphic that I showed where it had all the red squiggly lines, I think your story could be when you take one of those lines, just one. I think it's multiple stories on top of each other layered on that can seem so simple, but they're actually really what's happening within a system. Another example I'll give is data. We're often collecting a ton of data in schools now. But teachers are not given the time to look at the data, to talk to their fellow teachers about it, and to even use the data to support intervention. So even adding time, and who's involved with that? The principal oftentimes has the full system schedule. So you have to have time in your schedule. It has to be made a priority for you to actually get together and talk about the data. And having those data meetings can be a huge barrier bust to get evidence into practice.
Yeah, so many people have told me like the master schedule is the main thing. Just like, where is this stuff going to happen? And you need a principal who's going to be like, oh, we'll make it happen here, or here, or here. Yeah.
The other thing I'll say as one last note is I've talked a lot about implementation science, but there's actually a de-implementation science.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Because we can't pile on. Once we add something, we have to figure out how to make that the priority and how to get rid of something. And I think we see a lot of 3Qing still happening, even in schools that know and are doing a systematic explicit phonics. No one said, get rid of this too.
Yeah.
And so we have to think about what we're going to actually get rid of that's not scientifically supported.
Yeah. But then it becomes problematic too, as we all know in the sort of wake of Sold a Story, and if you've listened to the entire podcast, is this like banning things. Yes. And that becomes problematic too, because people don't understand the nuance or the contours of it, even the people who are like putting those bans in. So I think they're well-intentioned, and they come from the place that's very real, which is you can't just keep piling on. You have to get rid of things. And there are like things that conflict with each other. And part of the problem in schools is that it's a lot of what's happening is confusing to children. There's like a lot of different ways they're being taught, and you're asking like a 6-year-old to sort of like make it coherent, and it's really the adults who need to make it coherent. But it is, as soon as you identify what a problem is, you have policymakers eager to be like, well, we'll take that away.
Yes. I think it's about flexibility too, and that goes into the stages. Because one thing I've seen is some really well-intentioned policies that are hardwired, and they're swinging the other way. The pendulum again, it's swinging all the way over here. And it's unfortunate because policies can also be difficult to change.
Yeah.
And we really need
de-implement
the policy and change the policies.
Yeah.
So the policies I've seen work the best are the ones that are actually pretty flexible, and you can really work to change those. Margaret and I went to a scientific conference, and one of the biggest findings that she had from that conference was, wow, science is changing a lot. Like, we think it's just done. Like, we've made all these conclusions, and there are some things that are facts.
But here are the scientists, like, getting into the nitty-gritty details.
The nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, they don't agree on everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So so the equation, science times systems. So where do you think we really are right now with that as a nation? Like, where were we 10 years ago? Where are we now?
That's a great question. So implementation science is so new in a field, it's only the early 2000s.
But it's new. It's relatively new in medicine.
Yes,
which
exactly.
People look at medicine like, oh, they've got that figured out. No, they don't. That's why they created implementation science.
Completely.
Like, we have a problem here.
Because medicine is a complex system, and so is education.
Yeah.
So complex systems, they're similar in some ways, and they're very different in others. So this came out in the early 2000s, but the idea of getting evidence into practice really started in the 60s with diffusion theory, which was basically like, how do we diffuse this knowledge across the systems? So to your original question, where are we? I would say that we are on the tip of a precipice, and it's very exciting.
Of a precipice.
Yeah. Two things there. I really wanted to say on the tip of the iceberg, but I think we're on the precipice. So
we're on the precipice.
We're on the precipice of really getting this into systems now. I think that we have built up some evidence now. We have the evidence on what works. We have these, tools, we have the techniques, we have a large pool of strategies that we can pull from, not just from medicine, but we have them in education. But those educational strategies were just formalized in 2019. So we're talking pretty new. So I think that, as it keeps evolving and we keep getting the word out, I think we're closer than we think, but we're not doing it as much. I will say, though, that there has been a lot of focus on, educational leadership in general. There's been, needs assessments and plan, do, act, study cycles. The pieces have been there, but they haven't been really put into the full package. So we haven't gotten the full benefit of what implementation science can do.
Yeah. And I think this one of the reasons this is so key, obviously, is there's all this attention to these problems and trying to solve them. And one of the things that our system will do is get really involved in one thing and then look up and the evidence isn't convincing enough that it worked, and then we give up and move on to something else. And so, I do think that's a real problem that we face here, which is, I think we're already in a little bit of a, there's a lot of other things to think about. There's a lot of things schools are focusing on now. We've got a lot of cell phone bans and technology questions, all not disconnected from all of these things. But how do you sustain it? I feel like part of it is just helping people be realistic about what change looks like, what does success look like? So what does success, so when we have achieved, when we have gotten to the moon with the systems part, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really goes back to what we've seen in Margaret and Jamie's school, is it changes the way they think about implementing evidence. So they don't just think, I'm going to train teachers. They actually think about the system. So that's what it would look like. It would look like, instead of getting a curriculum and giving teachers 2 days to study it, it would look like, okay, first we're going to work together to determine what is the best curriculum, looking at the evidence and looking at the systems we have and how we can best implement that new curriculum into the system. And by the way, we also have to prepare the system. So what do we do to get the system ready? So it's really asking those two questions. It's asking, what knowledge do teachers need, but also, how do we continue with that knowledge, and how do we create a setup that makes it easy for them to actually do this work?
And then, of course, the stark reality is someday Margaret will leave that school and Jamie will leave that school. And so we have thousands of schools in America. So the only way that this stuff actually gets sustained is if it's happening at scale in a lot of places, or scale enough so that it is resistant to the people changing, because that's what you see over and over again, is good stuff happening in a school and one person or set of people changes, or a new person comes in and says something else from above, and it all falls apart. And that's kind of what season 2 of Sold a Story is about.
Can't wait. Cannot wait.
So now we're going to turn to you all for questions. So there are a couple of lovely ladies in the audience with microphones, so just get their attention, and I'm going to count on them to find someone. So we got someone back here. Hi. Let us know who you are and what your question is.
Hi there. My name is Jeremy Davis, and talking about the moonshot, my background is in public policy and aviation, and my entire career has been centered around implementation sciences, and particularly for aviation, there's this similar decades-long push to go from science to actually, changes and impacts that save hundreds of thousands of hours, millions of dollars, hundreds of lives. And I'm just wondering how, everything you're saying is like, yep, that's my whole career. It's a different language, but it's the exact same message. And so I'm wondering, how much are you reaching out to other folks in other fields that are working with implementation sciences to talk about lessons learned and different ways to apply those things? Because certainly in the aviation world, there have been some great successes and some really big public failures on trying to speed up that implementation process.
Yes, that's a great question, and thank you for saying that, because we are all in it together in terms of getting evidence to practice. It's not unique to medicine. It's not unique to education. It's unique to any field. It's not unique because it's any field that has evidence getting into practice. So I think we have a lot to learn from each other and really seeing converging evidence, like what worked for you might work also for education. But it's interesting because with implementation science, there's kind of twofold. One is seeing what's worked for others, but also there's this idea that it has to be context specific. So it has to be based on what's going to work. So you can't take what works in one school and say, okay, here's the formula. We're going to actually put it over here in this new school. So what we have to do is think about the process. Can I just say one thing there, though?
Yeah. Because I do also think, though, that there are general principles and things. And this is one of the problems in education is those. Sometimes I think we hold fast sometimes to the idea that every place is so different that you can't possibly. And it's obviously both things are true at the same time.
Yes, I'm glad you said that.
Okay.
Great clarification, because it's true.
Okay.
But I think it's one of those that it's like a glass half empty, half full. So on the half full part, it's like, yes, we know some of the things that are tried and true that work in all systems, and we can do that. The half empty part is that you can't just come in with a model and say it's going to work here, because you have to bloom where you're planted. You have to actually know what's happening in that system.
It would be, I don't know if implementation science is enough of a field that, like, do the aviators come together with the health professionals and the educators for a conference?
Yes.
That would be really, do they?
Yes, so implementation science is a methodology at heart, so it's a process. And so implementation scientists do come together, and there's people that actually study the science of implementation across fields.
What, are the educators getting invited to the conference
yet?
Yes,
we are, and it's been great.
Because I actually think part of the bigger problem here is sort of like, what makes a profession a profession?
Yes.
And I think one of the things that makes a profession is that they are sort of self-regulated and build on knowledge. And I actually, this may sound like too much of a criticism, but I think that's been a problem with teaching for a long time. I actually think it hasn't been built up as a profession in the same way that can sort of like, because there's been so much fighting about the knowledge. I'm not saying there's not fighting about the knowledge in other fields, but I think it might be slightly unique to education in terms of the amount that we fight about it, because we all kind of think we're a little bit experts on education because we all went to school, and so it's really, education kind of sits at a little bit of its own space of complexity when it comes to all this stuff.
I agree.
Okay, go ahead.
You touch on such an important point. So in implementation science, it's basically this idea of when do you become an implementation scientist versus when are you a content person, and it's really a gray line. I mean, it is, because people in my field, I'm definitely an implementation scientist. But when I go to an implementation science conference, I'm not an implementation scientist. I'm a content expert. So I do think that there's a lot of working together. It's a team science. So you want people from all different areas, and we benefit from having people that actually come with implementation science experience outside of education to take a fresh look and say, what are the levers we can push?
Yeah. Okay, another question. Who's got the microphone? Okay.
Hi. So I used to lead school improvement for a state, New Jersey, and it's interesting that you said what you said, Emily, because my question was about the tension of professional autonomy and this notion of professional autonomy. And I think because as educators, so much has happened to us that we hold this notion of professional autonomy really, really dear. but then we also can't be a profession if we don't. And so I'm just wondering about that tension and how you think it will play out in implementation science and how we solve for it. Because it's easy to forget that, like, there was a time when doctors didn't have consensus about washing hands in between patients.
Totally.
Like, that is crazy, right? But that was a thing for years. Like, who are you to tell me? I'm a doctor. I don't, And so it's like, well, people are dying. Okay, so I'm just wondering about this idea of professional autonomy because when we're talking about systems, nobody wants to be a cog in a machine.
Yep.
But on some level, does a system require that? I guess is my question.
That is such a great question. First off, with hand washing, that's one of the hallmark studies of implementation because doctors did realize we need to wash our hands, but they still weren't doing it. So what they found is that the easier you made it to do it, the more you were likely to do it. So notice when you go to the doctor, you often have right there the sanitizer, or you have the sink
Anyone
right
watch
there.
The Pit? They're
Yeah,
constantly putting the
constantly.
sanitizer on their
Yes,
hands.
that's right. But it's because it's easy to do. It was easy. So
Yeah.
they knew they needed to do it well before it became standard practice because it wasn't easy to do. To your question about autonomy, I think it's really important to look at other professionals and see how they've handled this. Doctors are one. I'm a speech language pathologist. We were taught to be evidence-based practitioners. I think that teachers can take a similar view potentially. Maybe that's where we need to think about as systems. So what I was taught to be an evidence-based practitioner is that you have three stools, so a three-legged stool. So you have evidence that you read and you take in, and that's your job. And you have to continually stay up on the evidence. So you have licensing that occurs because you get evidence, and that has to be good, solid evidence. The other part of that is you have to use your clinical judgment because it values the experience you have that you've had with patients, because science is always behind. So you have clinical experience with a case. And again, we see this sometimes with medicine where there's like a special case. It's like, how do we work with this? That informs evidence. But the other part is we have to think about what are our client preferences. And I think in education, that means what best serves our children. There's lots of research studies, for instance, that are done on children who speak one language. The majority of research is done on children who speak one language. You're teaching multilingual kids, you have to consider that. Does this science fit my kid? So of those three, the three-legged stool, that's how you become an evidence-based practitioner that feels empowered, that feels valued. But you have to be in a system that allows that value to occur as well. So I think that's a great question.
Another question.
My name is Hillary Somerville, and I'm actually dyslexic. I'm a visual dyslexic. I grew up in Fairfax County Schools, went to Langley High School, basically flunked out until my mom put me in a school where they taught me auditorily. So anyway, I went on to be an interior designer, and because I couldn't make it through school, and the only thing I could really do was use my visual abilities.
Put the microphone up there.
I could only use my visual abilities to create a profession for myself, and I had to hire other people to read and do stuff. So as an artist, I discovered that I could read in a spiral without changing the paper. Without moving the paper, and then we created software, and Johns Hopkins University came to us and did an efficacy study. And so my question is, I understand implementation because we're working with the school district in New Jersey. They're going to do a pilot program in addition to another Hopkins study. And so yes, I totally understand because I've been making manuals, talking to teachers. We have a Chrome extension, we have a writer, a word helper, and we're trying to make it a low lift for the teachers because so ours is just a computer software. All we did is change linear text to be in the shape of a soft rainbow. And so we didn't teach the children differently. We didn't create a new curriculum. We only changed how they visually absorb the text itself. And we decoded the words in chunks. So as a dyslexic and how do I help? I want to know how to help because now I have a Hopkins study that is very, very favorable. We had statistical significance. I don't know how to, I'm a designer, I don't know how to break through I have the science now. How do I help this community? It is really what my question to you, Emily, is. I binged your thing. And I was like, I think that you were so important, and because you told my story, and I really appreciated that. And as a 62-year-old woman, fourth generation Washingtonian, I want to help the other kids because I went through so much pain and like low self-esteem. And I want to help stop that train. So I'm here. That's why I came to see you.
Oh, well, I actually think you're asking an interesting question, and you haven't brought it up, which is like you talked about the researchers and the educators, but what about the parents and just the public?
Yes.
What role do they have to play here?
There's a big role to play, truly. So as community members, you can make a huge difference with partnering with your schools, which you're already doing, and working together with the teachers. I think we do not enough community engagement. We've created tension with schools and communities because of these labels to qualified children. I mean, you've reported on that for some time now, and I think we have to break that down and realize we're all working together for the same goal. And I really appreciate you sharing your story about, what it felt like to be in school. We have such a narrow view of success in public school. Unfortunately, if you can't read and you can't sit still, you feel like a failure. And you feel that very early on, but that's such a narrow view of success. And we have so many more opportunities. So I think the more that we infuse neurodiversity, the idea of neurodiversity, the idea of multiple pathways for learning into schools, which is what you're trying to do, the better the children will be and more successful.
And accepting new possible ideas.
Yes.
Have the science behind
Yep.
it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the thing. It's like,
Yep.
are we really looking for innovation
Yep.
with science?
Yeah. I think it's a huge thing.
A lot of walls.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Let's go to the next person who has the microphone.
You mentioned during your talk that you had done a book study with teachers. Do you have any, so I'm a teacher, I'm here with my county level resource person. I know we have a lot of different levels of people in the room. Do you have any books, articles, case studies that if people who are kind of in the messy middle of trying to implement all of this, what do you recommend that we have on our bookshelves right now?
Oh. This is really a tough question. Wow. Let's see. Well, I think what I want to do is skirt that a bit. Just going to be honest about it and tell you that what we do know from the science is that the community is what matters. So as long as you make sure you're choosing evidence-based and text to read, it's really the opportunity to work together on that text, to talk about it, to talk about how it applies. Oftentimes when I did a book study, I really did do a book study in the sense that, we read together, we talked about it, we thought about how does this apply to what you're doing now? How does this match what you're seeing in the classroom? And it was everyone having the time, which is such a luxury, to actually get together and talk. And we know that works. That's a strategy that actually gets evidence into practice, is having educators work together to learn something new, have the time to think about it, and have the time to think about how to do it in the classroom, and then come back and say, I tried it, it didn't work, or I tried this, and this worked. That community is what matters most, aside from the fact that you definitely want good texts that are evidence-based, but it's the community that's going to help you actually implement that evidence.
Hello, my name is Catherine. I was a student back in the 90s, early 2000s, and the story Sold a Story felt very familiar to me. And one of the things I noticed when this podcast was shared by a family member to me is that I instantly forgave my father for railing against the education system in a way that actually now I understand why. And I understand that he wasn't the problem, but the system was the problem, and he actually could see that the system was the problem and didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking about the many steps of implementation, and I don't know if this piece of it goes into the implementation of science, but there seems to me to be a piece missing in the conversation. Maybe both of you have a thought on this, I don't know, but the piece is how we frame disappointment, dramatic reframing of families in their perspectives with each other, healing, and so forth in such a long and imperfect process. And it seems like that's something that many different industries, medicine, of course, pediatrics. I mean, there are just so many ways in which that is very much, that impact is very much a part of this long-standing process. And is there a piece of recognizing that, a piece of helping people participate in that or understand that it's imperfect, and unfortunately you're not going to get what you want, perhaps. Yeah.
Well, I'll let you answer substantially, but I'll say that, I think you bring up something really important, which is there's a lot of anger in the world right now, and people have lots of ways to publicize their anger, and it's definitely a part of this process that a lot of parents are angry at their school systems. And I do think that there needs to be some sort of reckoning with that and a way to acknowledge the anger and then try to move past it. Staying angry isn't gonna fix it here. And so there does need to be just some level of better communication here and the anger is real.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for telling me that story and sharing it here in this community. I think one of the biggest problems that we face is that in the US in particular, we're taught that we're individualists. We have a very individualist society. We're taught that our destiny is owned by us, that we make that choice. And that ignores the systems that we live in. And I think that many times when educational professionals, medical professionals, we are acting like we're just one part and we don't recognize the system. So telling someone a diagnosis or having a IEP meeting and saying this is going on, and then not realizing the ripple effect that has on a family, on a community, because you think, well, I'm just here. It's just me, and I'm just here and I'm doing my thing. So realizing that we're all in a system, that we're all part of this system, and that everything we do affects everything else is a huge mindset change that I think can help us recognize that we all have something to give. And that when we think about education, it should be owned by the whole entire community. And parents shouldn't feel like they can't go into the school and speak their truth. They shouldn't be made to feel less than when they know what's going on with their child. They should be taught as equal, they should be equal partners. And that's not happening. And that's not happening not because educators don't love children and care for them. It's because they're in a system where they often, when I work with educators, they feel like they can't tell the truth. They can't say the truth in that system. So I think we have to really acknowledge the systems we live in and also some ways to get some apologies out there as well.
We have time for a few more questions. Who's got the microphone now? Here we go. Hi.
Thank you. Oh, I have one. I know there's another one out there. Hi, thank you. My name is Ashley, and I'm a parent. And I was just wondering if you could share if you've had any success or if you've worked at all with after-school providers as part of the implementation science. And I'm asking this because I know my own children spend 3 hours after school, and a lot of those providers are doing something much different than what's happening in the schools. So beyond community engagement, have you had any experience? Are you kind of making any inroads at all? Thank you.
Yes, we actually are. Thank you for bringing that up. Because the school day is so packed with required activities, we often have to work with after-school providers, and I think it is an untapped resource. Like you said, my own children spent time after school doing things, and they often had those who wanted to do the best for them but weren't integrated at all into the school. They would literally just show up to the school, and then everyone would leave, and they didn't even really have the same guidance, or it was just very disconnected. So I think creating those connections is what we've tried to do, but also using that time and thinking of schools as community centers, because that's what they really are. I mean, they're publicly funded, they're community centers, they have education during the time, and then the rest of the time, they should be used by the community, and children should benefit from that. So that is something we have been doing. We do that after school. We also do it in the summer. There's a lot of summer time that we work with our educational partners. But you're right, it's often a different system, so the coordination has to be there, and that's a missing piece. Thank you for bringing up that important link in the system.
I think someone else has mic. Yep.
Hi, I'm Paige Pullen. I have been a longtime researcher and now left higher ed to focus primarily on bridging that research to practice gap and being in schools on a regular basis. And I want to come back to something you said in your talk, Tiffany, about the simple view of reading. And one of the things that I notice that is continually a challenge, and that is you demonstrated the pendulum from one side of the equation to the other side of the equation. And for years, we were working on the language side through those reading wars and ignoring that explicit systematic instruction in word reading. Now we've shifted back, and much of the legislation, and I work very heavily at the policy level at states, and much of the policy is focused only on K-3, primarily focused on foundational reading skills. And there has become then a misunderstanding of the term science of reading, that it is about phonics and foundational skills. And when you see it in classrooms, you see that pendulum shift where kids are reading primarily decodable text. You don't see books in hands. And when you're working on the language side, or comprehension side, you're primarily looking at standards and standards-based instruction, where a standard is a curriculum, not an outcome. So I feel like we really need to work to bridge and see this is, as you said, a multiplicative equation, and that it's not an either or, and it's not even a both. It is a comprehensive system. And I feel like as a field, we really need to work on looking at this as a comprehensive system where we are teaching children from birth on to understand both the foundational literacy skills and the language skills that are going to develop expert readers. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about how we're combining those and how we, as a field who are working in schools, can help bridge that gap. I do it a lot, but I'd love to hear your perspective. And just one quick focus to the previous question, there is a group called Beyond School Hours, a professional organization who's doing a lot to try to bridge what's happening in after school and before school and summer school. So just a little tidbit.
Thank you so
Be
much.
interested for your response.
Thank you so much for that question. It really hits attention. And I think ultimately, one thing we know from implementation science is it's good to have the end goal in mind. So, but we also have to acknowledge we have to do it in stages. So Margaret Goldberg, my partner, presented on this analogy of a garden, where you have your overall idea of what you want in the garden. You have the whole plan, but you then have to systematically kind of plant and take root along the way. And so we know we need a comprehensive approach, but we also are humans, and we need time to learn and practice and implement. So having the overall idea in a 5-year, 10-year plan of like, here's what we're doing, and then systematically working to enact that plan is a great first step that we're not even there yet. So we have to then see we have to see what the goal is, the overall goal, which is making sure that we're covering both sides of the simple view and writing, and that it's integrated. Then we step back and realize, okay, how do we do that? What do we do the first year? What do we do the second year? How do we create systems? Maybe that's the flower beds that are going to actually make sure that this plant has the sunshine it needs and this has the water it needs. And so we have to have that all together. So that tension is we want to do everything at once. But when we do everything at once, oftentimes it fails because we're overwhelmed. There's no priority. Something falls off because we're humans. But if we actually do it in a way that makes sense and is planned out and is systematic, we can build those systems along the way, and we can know that what we're building is going to be sustainable because it's going to have the roots. And then it's all going to come together. But that's asking for long-term planning. And that's truly what we know from implementation science is we need those stages. We need that iterative process to make sure that everything blooms.
We're going to have time for one more question. So, and I have one comment to what you were talking about in terms of the pendulum swing. I do think that the knowledge part is key in not having the pendulum swing anymore. Yes. Because I think one of the things that distinguishes education in a not such a positive light from some other professions is that I think one of the things that happens in education is you can start to do like evidence-based things and then you can swing back. And see, I think other professions maybe don't do that quite as much, is like once the evidence is established, it might be hard to get it into practice, but you don't go backwards.
Yeah,
And I think
exactly.
because education is prone to fads, we go backwards in education. And so that's why this argument that we really need to like establish it as a profession that won't go back. It doesn't mean it's going to be perfect. It get everything out there. There are going to be lots of problems, but it doesn't go backwards. That's, I think, the thing that really needs to change. So we have one last question. Does someone have the mic for the last question? Okay.
Emily, why this question queues up.
Yeah.
I think with the garden analogy, I think we do tend to like rip out of bed. Like,
Yeah,
nope,
yeah,
we're
yeah.
done with that. Rip it out. See
Yeah,
you later.
yeah,
And we really need to
Yeah.
not do that.
Yeah. Let the old vines
Exactly.
take root. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I really admire and appreciate both of your work. My name's Michelle. I'm a literacy and dyslexia specialist, and I'm sitting here. I'm also the parent of a dyslexic child, which was what, put me on this path 6 or 7 years ago. But I'm sitting here as an educator who works with middle school students, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders who are struggling readers. And I feel very, prepared, and I understand the science of reading, and yet everything that you've spoken about today is just kind of building this fire inside of me, inspiration, frustration, like motivation, all of that. And what I'm wondering, and I imagine that there's many of us in this audience today who are directly interfacing with children and saying, now what? What can I do on Monday when I go back into the classroom, when I know that there is a problem with this system? The system, many of us would say it's broken, and often get to the point where it's just like, ugh, what's the point?
Yes.
Like I can just do what I can do in my little bubble, and the rest of it I don't feel like I have control over. I kind of am in like an up and down of feeling like, no, I've got this right now. I'm up.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay,
Monday might not
Monday.
Yeah.
But I'm sitting here saying, but actually, what am I going to do on Monday? Now I have this fire. Like a couple of things that stood out to me. You were saying, I train teachers because they didn't even know that they should assess language.
Yes.
And so I'm sitting here going, what assessment should I use?
Yes.
I would love to know just even that, like a little bit of information. But then also implementation science, I've been hearing about it.
Yep.
I understand the science of reading. I love reading the research. I've read so much of your research. This is, it's like a fan moment. This is better than a Taylor Swift concert.
We do have the mics.
Yes.
So.
But I'm also like, as a parent and an educator and just a stakeholder in this literacy crisis, how can I learn more and understand more about implementation science so that I can be a change maker within these systems that just aren't built for success?
Thank you so much for saying that. And I'm your fan, because what you're doing every day, you're doing that hard work and you're seeing those kids. So thank you. That is a loaded question, but I do have some thoughts on it. One, adolescence and middle school and high school is a perfect example of a system that was built for adults and not children. So we have to center children. Like, what do children need? Not the adults. So children go into middle school and somehow we think they've magically changed, that they're not the same kid that was just in 5th grade. Now they're in 6th grade, and now they're in a totally different system that assumes that they know how to read words, assumes that they got it all figured out, when we know that the developmental process is much later and it needs development across the lifespan. So we have to think about systems and how those systems can change to focus on the child. So I think taking that mindset. But the other thing I want to say is those up and downs are normal, and one of the best things you can do to create change is have a community that supports you. So we talk a lot about supporting children. We talk about having, centering on them. But at the same time, advocacy work tells us that you need a community. You need the phone a friend that's like, I'm really frustrated today. And they're like, you can do it. And so that community is how things changed. The community that was created from Soul to Story, the Decoding Dyslexia movement, that was about the ups and downs and supporting each other. So I hope for you that you can get a community, because you are a change maker. and you're making that change every day, but you need that support as well to make the change. In terms of learning about implementation science, a shout out to the RISE Institute, which is at the University of Washington, led by Erin Lyons. They are education-focused implementation scientists, and they've created modules online, which are really fun, actually. You can go and you click through. It's very easy, but it gives you a lot of great resources. So if you can search that up, that would be great. And we're trying to create more and more resources because implementation science is also caught in the evidence to practice gap. It's very meta, but we have implementation science, and we're trying to get it out. So we still have the gap in how do we get it out? And implementation science is part of a broader umbrella of translational research that also includes dissemination. So we often say D&I, dissemination and implementation, and the dissemination is what you're talking about. How do I learn this? How do I even access evidence-based materials? It's what you mentioned with the books that you need for professional learning. So I just want to say thank you. Keep doing the hard work and get a community to support you in that hard work because it is a marathon and it is not a sprint.
Well, thank you. Let's give a hand to Tiffany Hogan
Thank you,
again.
guys. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
I welcome back to the stage Britt Oates.
Why, thank you so much. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Dr. Hogan. One more time, you guys. Was that not amazing? Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And I actually have another favor to ask of all of you because there's quite a few educators and administrators and advocates and amazing professionals in what you do, and you all clearly care because you got up early and came here today. I would love for you to give yourselves a round of applause for the work that you do. You guys are boots to the ground. That matters. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you all enjoyed this program. Don't forget, if you have not done so already, visit us at planetwordmuseum.org and sign up for our newsletter for the latest updates and info on upcoming programs and events, including the next Eyes on Reading program coming up this fall. Yes? Excellent. September. Yes. Okay, so keep that in mind and sign up for the newsletter. Thank you all once again for joining us this morning. Have a fabulous rest of your weekend.